Heavens to Murgatroyd. Jack, you were at the station during a time when politics and the issue of race were very, very big items.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back on those days, what do you remember about the issues of the day and the people of the day?
Well, the issues of the day pretty well speak for themselves, but I remember, for instance, NBC News moving into our news department. We were running not only WSFA, but we were essentially at that time running NBC News because they lived with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we were required to, I say required, they requested, and of course we complied. We processed all of their film at that time. Did all of their network feeds out of our own station. In fact, there was a long period of time there before they sent their own people in that we did the feeds ourselves. I did many of them to NBC News. Then they sent Richard Valeriani in, and Richard just moved in,
mm-hmm.
Moved me out of my office almost, and we worked with them very closely. It was a very interesting period of time from not only the issues, as you say, in Alabama, but to me personally and working with NBC News.
Governor Wallace at that time was coming into national prominence. You did a lot of traveling with the governor.
I have a lot of fond memories of, and a lot of rather scary memories too, of going into the Ivy League colleges. He made a tour of the Ivy League. I remember shooting a speech he made one night from the middle of the skating arena, hockey arena at Brown University. I was out, carried the camera and out on the ice and shot his speech from the ice. It was rather cold out there.
I can imagine the atmosphere might have been cold.
The atmosphere was very cold. But I also envied at that time my newspaper colleagues because they had a pencil and a little notebook. Bob Ingram was along on that trip, incidentally.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to carry all the camera equipment. And the newspaper people didn't help me at that time. I pulled it along myself. But it was very interesting. Then another trip, we went to the West Coast, all the way up the West Coast, UCLA, all the California liberal colleges, all the way to Victoria, British Columbia, where the governor made a speech up there.
What kind of reception did you get personally as a Southern journalist in the Northeast, in the West, and in Canada?
Well, it was very, very warm, as warm as it could be, warmer than the governor got in many cases. But we were right with him. We did not see other people other than those who came to see the governor. And he had a tremendous following in those places. It was amazing the number of people sympathetic to his cause in those areas at that time. Later, of course, with his presidential campaign and all, it wasn't as amazing to me, but those were the first times that I had seen that Governor Wallace had the following in other parts of the country.
Looking back to the day-to-day operation of the station itself, anything humorous come to mind? You remember some of the funnier, lighter moments?
Yeah, a lot of them. I remember once when we were down in the basement where the news department was then. We called it the dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
And the air conditioning went out sometime around July or August, hottest part of the year, so I called Chief Engineer Dick Payne down to check it out. And Dick looked over the air conditioning problem and he sort of shook his head and said, well, if we can just make it till October, we'll be all right. And we made it.
A lot of things have changed since you were in the news operation. What was it like when you were working with the larger, more cumbersome equipment? Did that ever present a problem as far as getting around and covering a story?
Oh, sure. It very, like I say, moving it by myself when we went on these long trips, it was very cumbersome. You still work with that today. I think the biggest change, though, Bob, is the fact that you have more personnel today than you had then. I remember going out early in the morning covering a news story, coming back, processing the film, putting it together, writing the story, and then doing both the 6 and 10 o'clock news.
Makes for a long day.
It makes for a long day, but it was most interesting.
Then the lure of politics took you away from television news and took you to Washington.
That was an interesting experience. I have had a rather varied career, but have enjoyed every minute of it. And people ask me, do I miss television? Not really. Once I left, I took my new job and my new position in Washington with a great deal of enthusiasm and enjoyment too. The thing that I disliked the most about television was that deadline every day. I saw people at the station like Bob Villar and Carl Stevens and Phil Snow would every once in a while in the afternoon, Johnny Johnson, they'd go out and play golf or spend the afternoon doing something pleasant. But at 6 o'clock every day, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, Thanksgiving Day, 4th of July, Jack Venable was there and Bob Howell was there.
That's right.
And the deadline, I think, got to me more than anything else.
Having to do that grind.
Having to do that grind every day. And of course there are those days, as you know, where there is no news. You have to go look for it. I don't want to say you have to go make it. I'd rather say you have to go look for it.
That's right.
And you were talking about humorous things. I remember sending Bob Inman on one of those no news days out to the city dog pound to do an interview on Be Kind to Animal Week, one of those things that comes along, to interview the dogs in the dog pound. And Bob came back amazingly with a very good and cute story that filled up 2 or 3 minutes of that newscast. I remember a similar one when I sent Bob Brewer out on Thanksgiving to do an interview with the turkeys. And he did, again, a very creditable job with a rather difficult story. He was surrounded by 200 or 300 turkeys, and after he had done his story, his intro into it, he asked the turkeys how they felt about Thanksgiving, and he had the owner shoo the turkeys, and they all went running in various directions. So those are things you have to do. Those are the things, I guess, that make it more enjoyable than some of the other things we have to cover. I remember a day, for example, it was around New Year's. I don't suppose it was New Year's, but in either a day or two before or after, where in the first 3 minutes of the newscast, I had to report with film on 5 deaths that day in the area around Montgomery. And those things can get to you.
Sure.
They can get to you. They really do.
Well, Jack, we appreciate you taking time. How do we look on film there, Jack?
Maybe newspaper.
Yeah, okay, well, what about the transition now? Obviously, you've gone from the television news director to news press secretary, back to the newspaper business and into state politics. So how has this transition been brought about, and how do you like the newspaper business as compared to what you used to do?
Oh, I love the weekly newspaper business. I only have one deadline a week, and I really love living in a small town, of course, this being my home county of Elmore. I don't find that much of a conflict between the news business and politics. We're both doing essentially the same thing, serving the public. Even before I got in politics, people call me at the newspaper and says, why don't you do something about this? Or why don't you do something about that? So it's not really that different. A lot of people have asked me about a conflict between politics and the news business, but I don't cover in my newspaper state news. I leave that up to you and to the daily newspapers. I would find a conflict, for instance, in serving on the city council in Tallahassee, or perhaps even the Elmore County Commission, which I do cover. But I've had no conflict whatever between politics and the news business. They're really not that much different.
All righty. Well, I should be reading and be a voiceover and,
Oh, that's
and nothing.
Back, but Stan was back within a couple of months. You want to get some established, or you want to jump right into it? Okay. Let's go back to 1955, the first fall, actually, after the station was on the air. And you and a young football coach from Auburn University, Shug Jordan, began what has been a tradition with our station, the Auburn Football Review. What was it like back then?
Well, it wasn't nearly as easy as it is now. That's what older people always say to younger folks. You know, it was a lot harder when we had it, but it was very difficult. Most of the schools didn't understand what we were doing or why or who was watching, and most of the sports at that time was oriented toward newspaper. And it won't take you very long to realize that I look at the newspaper as our arch enemy. And at that time, they really were, only they were winning the battle.
Right.
It took a while before people began to realize that folks really are watching this and are enjoying it. But the greatest part of the experience that I remember is the wonderful association with Shug Jordan, who is just one of the finest people I've ever known, and I have a tremendous respect for him, for Jeff Beard, who was athletic director at Auburn at that time. With all of the coaches and players that came along through the years, it was a great experience that I'll never forget. I'm very appreciative for having known all of them.
You were talking about the newspapers winning the battle back then. What were some of the problems that a young television station ran into in competing with the newspapers when it came to actually covering the football games?
Well, for example, Georgia Tech wouldn't let us in their stadium the first year. We had to sneak in. And the second and third and fourth years, they wouldn't let us in the press box because when we said we need to get all the information for our program, they said, well, you can get that out of the newspaper. And we said, but you don't understand. We compete with the newspaper. And they said, well, whatever the problem is, you're not going to get in the press box. So we finally got that overcome, and then after a while, they wouldn't let us have sideline passes because they had a limited number, and they gave them to all of the newspaper people. So it took a long while for the struggling child to ever get to where it would compete head-on with newspapers.
What was it like when you were actually conceiving the show, deciding what was going to be on and what wasn't? How was this brought about? How did you actually format the football program?
Well, the format was pretty well established in the beginning, Bob. We basically wanted to show the whole game. And we went out with the idea of shooting all of every play and only cutting out that part of the plays between the huddle and the things of that nature that didn't matter. And we pretty well kept that format during the whole time. As a matter of fact, the photographers who used to work with us on that always brag that during those early years we missed only 4 or 5 plays a year in reloading cameras or some technical failure or something of that nature. Scott Brenner and Stan Tarleton, who I believe is still working for the station, were the guys who did that, and so we formatted it by that idea. And then the objective in the studio was that Coach Jordan would be the expert, and he'd tell why we did it, and I would try to tell what it was that happened and let the picture do the rest of it.
Have any problems getting the film back to the station and getting it processed?
Oh, yes, we sure did. As a matter of fact, sometimes we didn't start processing till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we edited by taking each play apart because the cameras that we used in that time made a noise between each time the camera was stopped and started, and so we had to cut out every one of those. So every play was literally taken apart and pasted back together. And I can remember several times that we did not finish getting the reel together until maybe 10 minutes before time for us to start running it on the air. And we were up all day Saturday and all night Saturday night and until the show went on Sunday, which made for some pretty deep sleep Sunday night.
I can imagine so. What was it like working back in the era of all live television? Some of those newscasts have to bring back some memories when all the commercials were live.
Well, they were, and not only that, but we didn't have teleprompters. We couldn't afford them. And we memorized all of everything that we did, except the news and sports, which we about half memorized and half looked at. We had stickers stuck behind all of the products so we could cheat and read a little bit whenever there was a switch in the camera, but we learned to do it because that was the way it was done at the time, and now that I look back, it seems very difficult, but at the time it was very pleasant and a great challenge.
I know that you made the transition from radio to television. It had to be, I'm sure back then there was a tremendous aura. It was almost like going Hollywood, I'm sure, to go television.
Yes, that's true. The biggest memory, however, that struck me was the necessity for being honest and candid. Radio was false in a way. We took on false sounds. We sounded pompous. We made stilted type announcements. And as television began to make its impact felt in the South, and you realized you were looking in somebody's eye and you were talking to a family sitting in their living room, the whole tone of the thing became more friendly, more off the cuff, more human beings talking to human beings, and it's been one of the great attributes of the business that it's kept that, in my opinion.
Is there any humorous story that comes to mind, looking back on some of the funny things that happened on the lighter side, so to speak?
Well, some of them, and only a few we can tell, Bob, I'll have to admit. I think some of the more interesting ones were when we would try to catch the referees making an error. And every game we'd come back and we knew that as soon as we got our slow motion process, we were going to prove that they were wrong and he was really out of bounds when they said he wasn't. And during the whole period that we did this, we never were able to do that. I was very impressed with how accurate they were. Sometimes when we would get to the stadium and they wouldn't let us in, it looks very humorous now. At the time, it was very serious. Some of the early things that I remember was the long winning string. I forget how many games it was now, 20 or 22 or something like that, that Auburn had where they didn't have a defeat. And the day they were beaten was in Gainesville, Florida, by the University of Florida, who did not have as good a team as Auburn did that year. And I think the most moving experience I can remember is standing at the airport and watching that group of fine young guys led by Red Phillips, and I think Lloyd Nix was on that team, and a fine Ed Dias, outstanding group of people, come back to the airplane and realize that they were all crying. And here were these fellows who could have run over us, very easy nature, who were deeply moved emotionally because they had lost the game and broken the winning streak. And I think that's probably what I remember better than anything else.
You remember the story about Bryant when he went up to interview him? Stan tells it, I don't know.
Yes, turn it off in the back.
I did.
Two of the people who played a prominent role, needless to say, Coach Jordan and Athletic Director Beard, two of the people I'm sure that bring back a lot of fond memories to you.
Yes, they do indeed. I think Jeff Beard was one of the most outstanding gentlemen I've ever met in the truest sense of the word. He was always very fair and very honest, and I remember him with a great deal of respect. Coach Jordan was the nicest guy to work with I've ever worked with. He was always there on time, even at times when he was under great pressure for having lost or having done something dumb the Saturday before. He was always very pleasant, very understanding. He was always the kind of a guy that if I had had sons instead of daughters, I would have liked very much for them to have played football for him. He had a great sense of understanding of the players and a great familiarity with them, and he was just the kind of a guy who was never out of sorts, despite the fact that football coaches get kicked around pretty hard sometimes when the scores are not what they ought to be.
Looking back to the first live transmission from the studio at Channel 12 back in 1954, I guess it would have been by then.
Yes, well, it was very interesting. As I recall, we signed on Christmas Day of 1954, and the first thing that we ever really did live that amounted to anything was in early '55, a private airplane bringing some prominent Montgomeryans back from the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville crashed down between Montgomery and Troy, I believe it was, and the occupants were killed. And at that time, we sent down a crew with an old speed graphic newspaper type camera, and they brought back an 8x10 photograph of the accident. And we fired up the studio cameras and showed these pictures and explained what was going on. And that was the first time that I recall that we were ever live from the studios there in Montgomery. During those early days, we would sometime, for example, send somebody out on a news story with one 100-foot roll of film and say, okay, that's all the film there is. Now, you either get the story on that much film or there's not any more because it costs too much money. And when we would film a commercial for a sponsor downtown sometime, it would be one take. And this was understood before you started. But
We were talking about doing commercials and doing live commercials. You say that one day you memorized and performed 50 commercials?
yes, for Montgomery Fair, they were having some kind of a back-to-school special or something of that nature, and Back in those days, we made most of our money from talent fees for performing spots, and they were my sponsor, and so we did about 50 that day. Of course, some of them were repeats, and most of them had a standard opening and a standard close, and you could read the part that talked about all of the clothes and the prices and things of that nature. So it wasn't that we were brilliant, Bob. It was just that that was the only way we could make money.
I know that with doing the live commercials, there had to be a lot of movement in the studio, the cameras and the props. There was a lot more involved in the studio back then than there is today.
Yes, a lot of horseplay amongst other things, because the great story was to see if you could make somebody laugh when they were on camera, because most of the things that we did were live. So most of us steeled ourselves against that, and only occasionally would you really find somebody doing that. And now that I look back on it, it was very amateurish and very unfunny to anybody other than us, and I'm glad that's all gone, and I'm glad that we don't have to put up with that anymore. I'm afraid that our television viewers in those early days were very tolerant and put up with a great deal that today they'd throw us all off the air for.
Well, they had nothing to compare it with, I'm sure.
That's a fact. As a matter of fact, we used to play music behind the test pattern before we signed on each morning, and we got quite a number of viewers who would get up to watch the test pattern and listen to the music.
With the Indian in the middle
That's
of the
right.
test pattern.
Had the Indian in the middle of the test pattern.
Leroy, thank you so much for talking with us. It's been a
I'm
pleasure.
delighted. I'm delighted. Thank you for coming.
I can remember.
And
That sure
Washington
helped a
Light.
whole lot.
Charles, you were involved during the time of racial unrest in the South, both in the Carolinas and here in Montgomery and in Birmingham. Looking back on those years, what do you remember from the news angle, so to speak, of these days? How well was it covered?
It was a tough and tense time, Bob, for everybody that was involved in it. That's one of the things that I remember the most. I think there were mistakes that were made on both sides. I think on the whole, though, that the coverage that was given to the civil rights movement in those days was good. The mistake I think probably that was made from the national level was that the national correspondents probably talked too much to the black leaders of the time at the expense of talking and having good contacts with the local authorities. And on the other hand, the local reporters went just the other way. They got too much of their material, too much of their information from the police and the established authorities, and didn't mix enough with the black community. And so I think there were some mistakes made there, but I think on the whole that the coverage was good. I would be the first to admit that the civil rights struggle would not have come as far as quickly had not television been around to bring it into everybody's living room.
Were there ever moments where you said, I just don't know if we should go with the story?
Oh yeah, I think there were a lot of times like that. There was a lot of indecision on the part of people, and there was a great deal of unspoken pressure that was put on local television news operations not to cover certain things or to play them in a different way. And I say unspoken pressure because I don't ever recall being called into management's office and sat down and say, hey, don't do this, or don't report that, or don't do it this way. But we knew how they felt, and we knew how people, responsible people, so-called, in the community felt. So there was some unspoken pressure. So many times we felt like we were doing things that was going to invoke the wrath of management and of some people in the community, and that was often the case. But it was not too bad. You know, we felt like we were doing the right thing, so that helped.
Going along with those same years, these of course were the Wallace years, both with Governor George Wallace and later with Governor Lurleen Wallace. Looking back on those 16 years of the Wallace administration, what was it like in the beginning covering George Wallace? Did you have the idea that someday this man would be a national political figure and would go on and be a third-party candidate for president?
I think that there were a lot of people who felt that way. I first covered him when I worked in Birmingham when he was running for governor. And then I left the state and was in South Carolina for a few years. When I came back to Alabama in 1967, of course, he'd been governor for a while and was already established as a national figure. So I don't think anybody who was around him was really surprised that he ran. And I also don't think anybody was surprised that he really didn't get that far with his national politics.
What? Okay, let's stop her.
Let me sit up.
Charles, the station was the first to hire a black on-camera news person. What was it like in those early days when that decision was made to hire a black newsman in Montgomery, Alabama?
Well, I was a news director at the time, and we talked with management about it a lot. And the idea was that, hey, you need to hire a black guy, somebody who's good, somebody who's professional at the job, and bring him in here, not as a civil rights expert, but as a general assignment reporter, like all the other reporters are with the news staff. So we went looking for some people. We found a couple, and Norman Lumpkin was one of them, and we called him up. He was working in Indianapolis then at a radio station and had been here in town working before at the old WRMA. So he came down here for an interview, and we really had to talk him into it. He wasn't really interested. But he got down here, and I think I can say this about Norman now because he's been here a while and he's done a good job. He really wasn't interested in the job. The only thing I think that really appealed to him at the time was that he was going to be the first black reporter around here, and he was going to be visible, and he was on the air. And I think that meant something to him. And he felt more responsibility than a lot of our other reporters did, just because he was kind of in that fishbowl.
Were there any problems in the early days with a black reporter?
Not bad ones. I recall being contacted by a county down in the Black Belt that wanted something covered down there that was worthwhile. And I said, yeah, we can cover that. That sounds like something we ought to give some attention to. And they said, but don't send that black reporter Norman Lumpkin down there. And I said, hey, I don't know who we'll send, but if you feel that way, we have to send who we have available, who we think ought to come. And if you feel that way about it, we just skip it. So we didn't go. But that was the closest thing to a major incident that I can recall. Norman might know a few others. He got the cold shoulder a lot from people who would be polite, but wouldn't go any further than that, and wouldn't give him a great deal of cooperation in some instances. But he overcame all of that because I think he did a good job, and people began to respect the work that he was doing. And he got along fine from that standpoint. I think maybe the black community here might have felt to begin with that he was going to be, hey, we've got somebody in news now, and he's going to be our spokesman, he's going to look after our viewpoint. But Norman didn't really look at the job that way. He kept us in touch with the black community and helped from that standpoint a great deal, helped us and helped them too, but we didn't assign him exclusively to those kind of stories.
How has news changed from your viewpoint now, from the way news was done, the way it was presented in the mid-'60s, as compared to today, other than in the obvious numbers of people?
Yeah, I don't think it's really changed that much. I think you're probably prettier than I was when you were on camera. But I have a criticism that was true when I was there, and it's still true, and I'm afraid it's going to be true for a long time to come. And I think that television news then and now is guilty of spending too much time on the things that are easy to cover, the club meetings and the various things that go on around town, the established situations and committee meetings and so forth. You tend to cover those things because you can get material out of them to use tonight.
Right.
After your reporter spends an hour or two there, he's ready with some material for tonight. Don't think television news spends enough time on the things that it takes 2 or 3 weeks or a month to get together, to put together a story and be meaningful with it. But that's a problem of time and money. I don't know when that's going to be overcome.
Of course, everybody wants to see it that night too, and working against that deadline does make a difference.
What Leroy Paul said.
Exactly the same
Did he
thing
say
he
the
said
same?
yesterday.
Yeah. I think technically, of course, the introduction of the videotape cameras have made a few changes, but for the average viewer, I don't really think they've meant that much. They, technically, I think the early introduction of them probably maybe even brought the technical quality of the picture down a little bit, but I know that that's going to improve with time. And it's, overall, I'm sure it's been a plus.
People say that we now have more time to do better stories, but when we get that time, someone always seems to say, well, you've got the time now, let's do more stories, and so we have more easy stories.
I think anytime you add new equipment and more equipment that you end up spending more time, taking more time to do the job probably than you might have thought you were going to take.
Perfect time. Are we rolling?
Yes.
Okay. Bob, looking back to May of 1968 and the death of Governor Lurleen Wallace, what are your impressions? What do you remember about the events leading up to and the coverage of the funeral of the governor?
Bob, I think the hardest thing I did in news was preceding that, to do a half hour, what turned out to be a of Lurleen Wallace before her death. And it was very difficult to do, not only for me, but for the people I was talking to. Stan Tarleton and I went to Tuscaloosa, spent 2 or 3 days up there interviewing people that knew her in high school, teachers, friends, family. People were very reluctant to talk about Lurleen because everybody knew what we were doing, you know, that she was near death and we were preparing something for that time. But they were very gracious, and we did put together a piece that we were very pleased with, and I think the family was when after the death. The whole period surrounding her death and funeral is just still almost a blur, because for 3 or 4 days everybody at the station just, you know, stayed up all day and all night and moving from one remote location to another, trying to provide as complete a coverage as we could to the funeral. It was kind of like the assassination, I suppose, of President Kennedy on a smaller scale. The fact that we were able to bring people that kind of coverage sort of held the state together, because people were very attached to this very gritty, very nice lady. Right. And I think it helped the transition from one governor to another for us to provide that around the state.
Specifically, what role did you play in the coverage of the funeral service itself? I understand it was quite extensive, the coverage that was done back then.
It was beginning the morning, early in the morning after her death. She died shortly, as I remember, after midnight. We started film coverage then. I got a call from the station and ran in here, grabbed a camera, went to the mansion, and then on to the governor's office, where the official announcement was made by her press secretary, Ed Ewing. And then beginning early that morning, we started putting together live coverage of the removal of the body from the funeral home to the mansion, and then from the mansion to the Capitol, where she lay in state for a day and a night. And then the next day to the church, which is very near the station here, and then on to the cemetery for the funeral services. And we were just dogging the steps of the procession during that entire time.
And this was, the situation itself was further complicated by the fact that there was an election on the Tuesday night following her death, which I'm sure complicated the situation for trying to program the station.
Probably the biggest complication was the difficulty in those days of putting together remote coverage. You don't have the microwave capability that this station and others do now, where you can get a live signal into the station from anywhere in town in a matter of minutes. But at that point, it was a matter of the phone company putting up landlines and bringing in remote buses. We had every piece of rolling stock, I believe, in the state of Alabama involved for educational television. Maxwell, seems like some equipment out of Birmingham, all pooled together to do this. But it was a technically monumental thing, most of which I never saw. I was simply in front of the microphone and the camera, and, you know, somebody put it together and said, speak, and I spoke.
When did it finally soak into you or hit you as to the impact that this had had on the state of Alabama?
I think I think when it really came home to me was standing in the governor's office at the swearing-in ceremony of Albert Brewer, which happened the afternoon after the death. You know, that this was just a monumental thing in history. The fact that Lurleen Wallace was only one of 3 women at that time who had ever been governor of a state. And the way she got elected, George Wallace could have never elected her had she not been electable. She got out and really campaigned, you know, and won people over. She won the thing herself. Being a Wallace didn't hurt, but she won it herself. And then the transition to what was a new style of governor for Alabama. I think standing there in the office that afternoon as Brewer took the oath of office, it came home to me that here was real history in the making, and I was fortunate enough to be standing on the spot. I've never been at that particular point since then.
About the secretary.
Okay, and then shortly after the change of governors, when Governor Brewer took office, you left the news staff here and became his press secretary. What are the events that led up to this?
Well, that also was a complete surprise because I really didn't know Albert Brewer that well. He was a news contact. He was the lieutenant governor, and I was covering the state capitol at the time, so I knew him from having covered him, interviewed him up there. But, you know, as far as being personal friends, we were not at all. Friday morning, I think it was, the funeral was on Thursday, and he had to put together a staff, an immediate governor's office staff, in a big hurry. Some of the cabinet stayed over from the Wallace administration, but the immediate staff around him, he had no one. So he called me on Friday morning, and I went out to a local motel and talked to him. I was flabbergasted to be that young, 23 at the time, and be asked to serve in that kind of capacity. Also fascinated by the opportunity to get an inside look at government and politics. It was a tremendous education. So I believe it was that weekend I went to work in the governor's office. So when Monday morning dawned, I had made the switch from the hunter to the hunted.
And what was it like being on the other side of the fence?
It was a delightful experience for the most part. Being in the governor's office and close to where news is being made from the other side was very interesting. Had what I thought was a very good, healthy relationship with the Capitol Press Corps. Enjoyed that very much. Enjoyed working for a governor who appreciated the being open and candid with the press, and I think he really shot straight with them during his administration. The campaign that followed was a traumatic experience. It was a losing campaign, but that was a lot of fun too. I learned a lot. And then after all of that was over, went back to television news, and I hope put some of what I'd learned to work.
Did your ideas about what is news and what is not news and what the public should or should not know change once you went to the other side of the fence?
I think I got more hard-nosed than ever about what is news and what isn't, because I saw government work from the other side. And I suppose covering institutions, government especially, is the most important thing that news people do. And I was convinced that hard-nosed reporting about government was what served people best. Seeing it from the other side just reinforced that.
Converse with me. Let me give you
Okay. I will do the talking, right? Are you still rolling? Okay. So we'll talk about the fact that that Bear Bryant has a chimpanzee named after him, and we had a bit on Alabama Illustrated.
Saw that. Yeah.
Well, Phil was asking him if the hat.
I wasn't until my wife told me. She had seen the show one Saturday night and said, you know, he's really named after Bear Bryant.
That's really strange.
But,
Okay, we need some serious cutaways then. Last time I was up in Tuscaloosa, Tony and I went out to the President's Club, or whatever the name of it is.
University Club.
University Club,
Right,
yeah.
right.
It was really nice, and the food
Yeah.
was terrific. We had a great time. And, you know, I was really, for some reason in Tuscaloosa, considered 12 to be almost like the source.
Mhm.
A lot of people,
Yeah.
they're really into what we have to say, and it's a big deal if it's on our station. But It really, that impressed me, and I keep that in mind when we're, when we're looking at stories that are coming out of hospitals, or stories that will have impact on me.
Well, people are tuned in to state capitol news up there, I guess with the university.
Yeah.
And mental health down here affects Tuscaloosa in a really big way. Probably half the employment in town is either at the university or connected with mental health, half the big employment.
I was in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago, and someone was telling me about the number of people that are employed by...
Going up there to break ground on a hospital where all you could see for miles, almost miles, was just where they had leveled shacks out in an urban renewal area.
Yeah.
And now all of that is occupied by buildings.
Yeah. And to think, I've always thought, well, the steel companies will be the biggest employers, but I think someone said if you took the top 2 steel companies up there and added their employees together, it wouldn't be as much as the university system, which is fascinating.
And you figure in all of the other medical stuff going on.